Hey everyone, welcome to this talk. My name is Behnood, and in this video I'm gonna talk about modern JavaScript, specifically ES6. And by the word modern, I mean there's also a traditional JavaScript. For this talk, I'm assuming you all are a little familiar with JavaScript, so I'm not gonna explain everything from the beginning. Technically, no one can explain how JavaScript created like its creator, Brendan Eich. And I highly recommend this talk by Brendan Eich, A Brief History of JavaScript, so you can know everything about ECMAScript, version history, ECMA 262 editions, everything about it. There's one thing I want to note in here. The sixth edition of ECMAScript came out in 2015, so we call it ES 2015 or ES6. So as you can see in here, since 2015, every year a new version or a new edition of ECMAScript comes out with some breaking changes and new features. By the way, ES6 was the reason that we got the new JavaScript or the modern JavaScript. So it's very important to know everything about ES6. So yeah. Here's an overview of ES6 features. There are three major groups of features in ES6. Better syntax for features that already exist, for example, classes and modules, new functionality in the standard library, for example, new methods for strings and arrays, promises, maps and sets, and completely new features, for example, generators, proxies, and weak maps. So why ES6? What problems does it try to solve? To answer these questions, I wrote some major JavaScript problems and ES6 solutions together. So as you can see, there are problems and solutions. For each problem, there's a solution. By the way, in this video, I'm gonna focus on the first problem, block scope, and we're gonna examine the rest in the next videos. In order to understand the problem, first we need to know what causes the problem. So let's take a look at these examples. The code on the left, or the first example, shows how function scope is created. In here we got a global variable named a that equals to 2, and then we got named fe, or a named immediately invoked function expression that I will cover up in the next video. So the function scope is created by the function foo. If you run this code, you'll see 3 and 2 in the output. By the way, you don't have to run this code in your browser console. You can use NodeMon to run your code via terminal, so you can see what happens every time you change the code. It's easy and super fast. Okay. So what about the other example? You see the if statement with the same variable declaration is added to the function's body. If you run this code, the result will be only 2. The question is why? The if statement creates the block scope. This technique is called block scoping. So, what happens to the block scope? You see, this is the question which ES5 cannot answer, but ES6 has an answer. Using let and const instead of var. So let's see what happens when we replace var with let and const. If you run the first example, you'll see 3 and 2 in the output. How about using another variable like b? This time you'll get the reference error. B is not defined. This is because the block scope doesn't know about the outside of its scope. And how about using const instead of let? The result is the same, but the difference is the initial value is not changeable. So you get the picture. What about loops? This example is more complicated, and you see another ES6 feature, the arrow functions. We can use let in the loop heads instead of var. Declaring a variable with var in the head of a for loops in a head of a for loop creates a single binding for that variable. Every I in the bodies of the arrow function refers to the same binding, which is why they all return the same value. If you declare a variable with let, a new binding is created for each loop iteration. This time, each I refers to the binding of one specific iteration and preserves the value that was current at that time. So each arrow function returns a different value. Const works like var, but you can change the initial value of a variable declared with const. In a for-all loop, again, var creates a single binding. Let creates one binding per iteration, And const also creates one binding per iteration, but the binding it creates are but the bindings it creates are immutable. In a for loop, again, var creates a single binding, and let creates one binding per iteration. Const also creates one binding per iteration, but the bindings it creates are immutable. The for in loop works like the for loop, so the results are the same. Coding style: var versus let versus const. There are some rules in here, and let's see what they are. You shouldn't replace each var with let or const blindly. It's so risky. Only use let or const in new code. Leave old code as is or refactor it carefully. Use const for things that are completely immutable. Use let for mutable things. And it's okay to use const for a mutable object. Thanks for watching.